So, we are continuing our series, walking through some of these stories of the well-known and lesser well-known women in the Bible. Who can tell me who we talked about last time? Two people. Oh, did I hear it? Did I hear it? It was Deborah and Dale. Bam, you got it. Excellent. So, Deborah, as we talked about, was called a judge. Don't think of it as like Judge Judy. Think of it more like she was a combo of like local mayor and like chief of police kind of thing. Now, this was the time before Israel was a united kingdom. It was really a time when each of the tribes were very independent, their own almost little city-states. Now, the next person we're going to talk about, Ruth, her story is set during the time of the judges. The book of Ruth opened with that. This story is set in the time of the judges. So that's why we're going to talk about it here. Now, the story of Ruth, it's a pretty quick one. I want to say it's like 4 chapters. And it kicks off really sad. So it starts off with a famine ravaging the land that will become Israel. Our main characters are a family. So it starts with the mother Naomi, the father Elimelech, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they are living in Israel trying to make their way through this famine. Ultimately, they decide they can't. So they decide, let's try to go somewhere else. So they end up immigrating to the land of Moab, hoping the famine is less severe here. And it turns out it is. But this family, not a lot of good happens to them. Because almost as soon as they get to Moab, the father, Elimelech, dies. So now Naomi is left with her 2 sons in a foreign land. But things do start to look up. The family seems to get settled in. Both of the children marry. They marry local women, and things seem to be going well. But not for long. Who knows what happens next? Both sons die, leaving Naomi alone with her daughters-in-law. Now, Naomi tells her daughters-in-law, whose names are Orpah and Ruth. So there's Ruth, the one we're talking about. She tells them, I think it would be better if you went back to your fathers. Because then they'd be protected. Because then they could potentially remarry, and they could potentially have a good life. Because as things are right now, they really have nothing. There's a lot of back and forth. Neither of them really want to leave. But eventually Orpah agrees, goes back to relives with her father. But Ruth has no part of this and responds with, and I'm sure someone will call me on this sometime. I say this a lot. This might be my favorite passage. Ruth's answer to her mother-in-law when her mother-in-law says, go, you cannot stay with me. Ruth replies, do not press me, and this is Ruth chapter 1, starting verse 16. Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, even more as well, if even death parts me from you. So that is, I would argue, maybe one of the best soliloquies about love that has ever been uttered. Ultimately, Naomi agrees. So Naomi and Ruth go back into the land that will become Israel. They return to what ends up being Bethlehem. But they return with nothing. Now, the famine has lifted a little bit, so they can maybe try to make a life for themselves. But point number 1 is they need food. You need food immediately to survive. But they come up with a plan for this. And this is Ruth talking to Naomi in Ruth 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone whose sight I might find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Okay, what is gleaning? Basically, it is picking up leftover crops that have fallen. So there was a lot of rules in the Mosaic Law, the Law of Moses, that the people followed around this idea. And it was as hired field hands were collecting crops, anything that fell to the ground, they were not allowed to pick up. Because the idea of that was that is what God put aside for those that need it, for the poor, for the orphan, for the widows. And so that was how they were to get food, essentially. So Ruth does this. She finds a field and follows behind the workers gleaning. Now, just a random aside story. I do not have much farming experience at all. But the one thing I do have is the little town. So I grew up in Washington State on the coast. The little town I grew up in, the town right next to us, called Squim. It calls itself the lavender capital of the world. And they might be right. There are a ton of lavender fields there. They have a massive lavender festival every year. It's huge. So it was a very common job for high school students to have to work in the lavender fields. And so I did. And it wasn't fun. Like, it was the Pacific Northwest, so it doesn't really get all that hot. But of course, you know, the couple days you had to be out harvesting, it was going to be the hottest it was ever going to be. And I can recognize this was the cushiest farming job of all time. The farm I worked on was one of my high school biology teachers' farm. This is something she did kind of on the side. She would bring us out lavender iced tea and lavender cookies, legit, probably like every hour and a half, 2 hours. So like it was very cushy and as easy as it could be, and I still didn't like it. It was not fun at all. So I can only imagine Ruth, who didn't get lavender cookies every 2 hours brought to her. I can only imagine just how much worse, how much strain this was. As our story continues, she continues gleaning. And she meets a man named Boaz, who turns out to be the owner of the field she is gleaning in. And Boaz comes to her and says, hey, why don't you come over to the table where my hired workers are? On break time, you can have some of the water. You can have some of the food there. Which he doesn't have to do. The owner of the fields, their only thing they had to do was just allow the people onto the land. But then he goes on and says, I promise I will protect you from the other gleaners and from the farmhands. Because a lot of times they weren't the most savory of individuals. And so when Ruth asks, why are you being so kind to me? Why are you doing this? He responds by saying, because what you've done and what you are doing for your mother-in-law is known to us. So people recognized her kindness, her loyalty, her love, and it stood out to them. It stood out as special. And so they wanted to reflect that and repay that. So Ruth goes and tells Naomi about this. And Naomi has what we call a pretty interesting response. This is Ruth chapter 2, verse 20. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. She's talking about Boaz here. And Naomi said to her, the man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin. Now, how different translations take this phrase, one of our nearest kin, will vary. Most often you might have heard it referred to as the phrase kindred redeemer before. It is the Hebrew word migoalainu. And essentially, it is an official office or title. Maybe the closest comparison we have for it today might be like godparents, or maybe next of kin. So it was an official legal title in which, say, a person dies, all of their livestock, their land, their possessions, everything they own goes to their closest male relative. That person is what's called the kindred redeemer. Along with that goes the responsibility of caring for the dead man's family. There's a couple kind of reasons for this. The first one was, in theory, it prevented a couple people from acquiring all the land and all the wealth. Because if things had to be passed within a family, essentially things were kind of kept categorized family to family. It prevented kind of a monopolization from happening. The second reason is it made sure orphans, widows, low-income people, people who needed help, were helped. because it was almost like the dead person saying, here is all of the land, here's everything I have. If you take this, use it to take care of my family. It was a way to make sure people were protected. Naomi gets really excited. So Naomi and Ruth, they go to Boaz and tell him of this. Now what's interesting in this dynamic is they are going to him and saying, you are the kindred redeemer. You have the legal right to all the property, all the land, all the everything, and to care for us. But remember, they don't have anything. So essentially, they're going to Boaz and saying, it's your legal responsibility to care for us, even though we don't have anything to help with that. So there's a whole go back and forth. There's another person in line first. That person doesn't want to take the responsibility, so through a whole legal system, it gets passed down to Boaz. But eventually, Boaz does and says, yes, I will fulfill the obligation to my family to take care of my family's family, essentially. Now, the story even goes on, and eventually, Ruth and Boaz get married. And they get their hallmark ending to their story, right? That's like the ending you always think of. I am legit shocked there has not been a Hallmark movie about Ruth and Boaz. I would not be surprised if there's a terrible, there's one out there. There has to be. So that is essentially the story of Ruth. But she pops up one more time in the New Testament, in Matthew 1. Who can remember what that is? We talked about it a couple weeks ago. Genealogy. So that is Jesus' genealogy. Now, if you recall, who else was listed in this genealogy? Anyone remember? Rahab. So Rahab, the mademoiselle of a brothel, who turned toward Yahweh, recognized the power of Yahweh, is listed in the family of Jesus. And next comes Ruth. Now, if you recall, we actually saw Ruth that last week. Rahab is Ruth's adopted grandmother. So I just love the kind of filling out the widening we're starting to see of Jesus' family. Because now we have not only Rahab, but also Ruth, the exiled immigrant who prized love and loyalty above everything else, enters into the family tree of Jesus. And we touched on it, there's not very many women listed in Jesus' family tree. And so the ones that are highlighting something big. We have Rahab, now we have Ruth. Working on this ever-expanding family. Working on seeing how expansive Jesus' family really is. It's not just this line of David. It's pulling from the cultures, from the people around. So with that, let's move to our questions. Online people, we will see you all next week. I don't know who we're doing yet. I have not worked that far ahead. But it'll be good, so we hope to see you then. Until then, goodbye.